Here's a fun fact. This is crazy. So real GDP is not a quantity. As new goods get introduced, they can cause the relationship between our wealth and our willingness to sacrifice consumption for safety to go the other way, making us willing to sacrifice less consumption for safety because the consumption tastes so damn good. This is sort of a pessimistic view, but economic theory is primarily a destructive project.
How do we detect the economic singularity?
Okay. Yeah, that's a big one.
Hello, my name is Anson. I am a researcher at Epoch AI. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Phil Trammell. So Phil is an economist at Stanford University, and he has thought a lot about all sorts of scenarios involving economic theory and AGI, and knows a lot about different kinds of thought experiments relating to this topic. So I thought it'd be really great to have you on. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you, Anson.
So let's start with explosive growth. Most discussions about AI and explosive growth so far have focused on one particular family of economic growth models, which is the semi-endogenous family. What do you think about that? Like, what are some issues with how most people have been thinking about AI and explosive growth from an economic perspective?
I think the biggest issue is that not enough people are thinking about it at all. There's been a lot of anchoring on a particular semi-endogenous growth model, the Jones model. In the Jones model, the constraint on growth, in particular on technology growth, is just a lack of research inputs. You have researchers do R&D, they develop better technology, and that speeds growth. The only reason why we don't have really, really fast R&D already is because we only have so many people doing it. And so if we automated it, if we created lots of AIs, lots of robots doing R&D, we would have really fast growth. One issue is that might not be the whole story, right? It could be that a so-called Schumpeterian model is closer to correct in some contexts. This is a model in which the main thing constraining growth is that every innovator needs a patent or a trade secret or something. They need a temporary monopoly on what they're producing in order to justify the cost of developing the innovation. And so on those views, growth has to proceed slowly enough. The sequence of new innovations has to come sparsely enough for it to be worth doing any innovation at all. And I think we see this potential worry in how the LLM market has unfolded, where because each one has so little moat, they keep pouring money into making better and better models, but very quickly, someone makes an even better one and steals the lead, and everyone quickly switches over to the competitor. So there have been these worries about how sustainable this is exactly. And in these models, R&D is for simplicity typically presented as being just a function of capital expenditure. So if you ask, taking the model totally literally, what happens if you automate R&D? Well, nothing, because it's already all about the lab equipment. And that's going too extreme. Again, I think the Jones story is closer to right if you have to pick one. But there's been so much work anchored on the Jones model that I think probably taking a look at other approaches would be informative. Given the Jones model, or a model kind of in that class, I think we're sort of led astray by a few things, but let's maybe say a bit about two in particular. One is that in the Jones model, there's not a hard limit on how much research can be parallelized at a given time. So if you scale up the number of researchers really fast, the rate of technological progress goes to infinity with the research inputs. Maybe not one for one, maybe the rate of progress is like the square root of the inputs or something, but still a sudden, really arbitrarily big surge in the inputs means that you make really fast technological progress. And I think that just can't be right. Like if you think about an assembly line, bring in loads of engineers and management scientists or whatever to speed up its production. The more you stuff in, the faster progress they'll make. But as the number of engineers goes to infinity, the rate of progress that they can make in like 5 minutes, it just hits a ceiling, right?
Right. So I guess like another example here would be like, no matter how many GPT-3s that OpenAI is running, they can't just like arbitrarily push up the rate of algorithmic progress by running like a trillion instances of GPT-3.
That's right. And importantly, I mean, no LLM can like single-handedly carry on AI research at all, right? With GPT-3 alone, they can't really make any progress, right? You need people and GPT-3, or even just people. So I think it's actually like a little bit of a different case, but it's another example of gross complementarity, at least.
Right.
Yeah.
So like it would be that even if we had GPT-3 plus lots of humans, if we scaled that up arbitrarily, we still wouldn't be able to just get arbitrary algorithmic progress.
Yeah, that would be the tighter analogy.
I see. Okay. So should we just totally scrap this Jones law of motion then? Is this law of motion just fundamentally going to be way too aggressive?
No, so well, it's very simple, and it's for many purposes, I think it makes reasonable predictions, and so we shouldn't always scrap it. And to the extent that it leads us astray, it could lead us astray kind of in either direction. And I think this is a common pattern I seem to run into. When you think of a bottleneck that models haven't been incorporating before, on the one hand, the lesson could be, oh, well, actually growth won't be as explosive as we thought, because once we relieve some other bottleneck, we'll just slam into this new one we'd forgotten about. But on the other hand, to the extent that we've been constrained all along by the bottleneck in question without realizing it, then, if this is a new margin on which we could get more growth than we had been anticipating, because it could be relieved. It could be getting relieved more quickly than before. So in this case, the reason why scaling up the number of people and computers working on algorithmic progress, just running GPT-3 wouldn't make progress go to infinity, is the high latency that different human brains have between each other, right? It's hard to efficiently divide a big project among lots of different people who only have like faint understandings of what, what part they are playing in the big kind of, the big orchestration. And we've been getting better over time at collaborating, and the internet allowed for collaboration with people with complementary skills in very different parts of the world, and whatever. I mean, obviously, if you go back far enough, the invention of language and writing and everything, obviously, lowered latency in some sense, and that's been furthering growth all along. But the rate at which that bottleneck's being relieved could rise pretty radically, I would think, in the event of neural nets, kind of virtual brains that are themselves getting bigger and bigger. So instead of having 1, 2, 3, 4 employees, you have fully integrated minds that are 2, 3, 4 times bigger. So assuming a sort of constant rate of penalty for parallelization, a constant sort of exponent on the research inputs in the Jones model, would be leading us astray in the sort of pessimistic direction. If you want to think through the problem carefully, we probably shouldn't be using the Jones model, because it doesn't even work well as a bound, right? It could be leading us astray in one direction or the other. But if you want simplicity, then and if you're not going to be extrapolating kind of like too far out of sample, then it's still, kind of simple and insightful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess like the tricky thing for us is that we're thinking about AI, and that almost necessarily entails us like having to extrapolate a lot of things like pretty far out of bounds of like the regimes where they're
Yeah,
being tested.
yeah.
So one question here that is also pertinent to models like Tom Davidson's full takeoff model and the gate model is that we might get declining returns to scale over time as we make further and further technological progress. And I know that you've been thinking a little bit about this. So how fast has like this decline been? Like, what do we know about this question?
I think you're referring to this point that ideas get harder to find, and the rate at which ideas are getting harder to find might itself change over time, right? So that's something else that the Jones model doesn't feature, and I think that's a much smaller weakness than this parallelizability point. But it's still a strong assumption, and I think probably an incorrect assumption. Yes, something I used to think was that in the grand scheme of things, the rate at which ideas were getting harder to find was itself growing kind of non-negligibly, and that you could see that by comparing the function from growth in research inputs to growth in productivity outputs in the distant past to in the more recent past. So there's this famous Kramer paper from 1993 that if you look over like the million years of the Malthusian past, he estimates that like basically that ideas aren't getting harder to find at all. Like that every time you double the population, you double the rate at which they are coming up with proportional productivity improvements. The data is really sketchy, obviously, but I think even after accounting for that, it seems pretty robust that this ideas getting harder to find effect does not appear very strongly in the distant past, if anything like Kramer's data are to be accepted. And by contrast, this well-known paper, Our Ideas Getting Harder to Find, from 2020, finds that over the last century, you have to be growing the research inputs kind of 3 times faster than the your target rate of growth in sort of productivity. So I thought, okay, wow, so that's a big change, and if you project it forward, then the rate at which ideas get harder to find will keep on rising until eventually we just hit the ceiling of technological maturity, or before that, right? If there's some technology levels that are like feasible, but that we kind of just we never really get to because we slow down before we were anywhere close. On thinking about it more, I think that's probably not right, and the big difference between that analysis of the distant past and the sort of analysis in the Our Ideas Getting Harder to Find paper is that in the past, they're looking at how quickly we can create more copies of the same object, namely the human right. body. And as I was saying before, modern growth is mainly not about that, but about creating new kinds of goods and higher quality goods. Another difference, of course, is that modern growth is often, driven by profit-seeking R&D, right? Which can be constrained by that creative destruction issue I was getting at before. So the issue here would basically be, if people, if a few hundred years ago we come up with the idea of patents and we have a sort of entrepreneurial culture take hold where people are like trying to invent new products and new production processes and everything and capitalize on that, that's going to really boost growth at the time because it's something people could have been doing all along that they weren't, and now they're doing it. But that process is just capped by something different from the kind of old like Malthusian purely resource constrained thing driving growth, right? So you get this burst of extra growth that starts picking up, and the Industrial Revolution and so on. And that adds a lot. But if it itself starts slowing down for whatever reason, that's just like unrelated to the rate at which ideas are getting harder to find or whatever, right? Then in a model which only has room for ideas getting harder to find, you'll pick that up as ideas getting harder to find. Okay, so this is there was a paper actually by James Besson and a co-author, I'm forgetting, just recently, which makes this claim, actually, that ideas haven't even been getting harder to find over the last century, sort of properly understood, but that R&D's been contributing ever less, like per unit of R&D expenditures or R&D effort. It's been contributing ever less to productivity growth, because for whatever reason, it's sort of unfolded in a direction where new R&D efforts have ever more so been cannibalizing past ones, which both discourages investment to begin with, and of course is itself, it itself means that you're adding less to the, if the big new thing is that you like come up with Amazon or something, but like that makes you a multi-billionaire, and so it warrants like billions of dollars in investments and how to get all the logistics right. But actually, without you, everyone would just be shopping at Walmart, and the consumer surplus and everything would just be like a penny less, right? Then you're not actually increasing output very much. You're just sort of like transferring it by winning the race a second faster. But both parties still run almost the entire race, and that's been happening all along. But that kind of thing, according to Besson, is happening more now. And so if you're just looking at a sort of time series of R&D inputs to productivity growth over time, you'll think, oh, ideas are getting harder to find, but that's not really what's going on. Now, I don't know if that's entirely right, okay? But it's another example of how I think you're really comparing apples and oranges when you look at modern growth, where it's all about like, kind of like, on the intensive margin, right? More and different kinds of things per person than the old Malthusian kind of regime. And so I don't think you can infer that the rate at which ideas are getting harder to find is itself rising.
Right. So I guess like the takeaway is like, we would like to be able to answer this question, but then the data is like not really comparable between different regimes. Like on both like the R&D inputs and the R&D output side, there's also this like sort of emitted variable bias kind of issue that's going on that kind of makes it like not directly comparable. Well, okay, that's kind of unfortunate because we would like to know like what these bottlenecks are for, say, hardware efficiency and software efficiency. I guess it's just too hard to say. Okay, changing tacks a little bit. You've written the paper about how new products and new varieties of goods is an important consideration when we're thinking about the real impacts of economic growth. What exactly is missing from the current way that we think about economic growth?
Yeah, the problem is that we try to flatten growth in the goods and services we enjoy into a single variable and put a number to how much that variable is growing. I'm not making a standard critique of GDP here. It's somewhat standard, but I'm not making the particular standard critique that it leaves out all kinds of things, sources of value other than consumption, like, leisure or friendship or whatever. That's true, but what I'm saying is that even when it comes to consumption, the part of all that matters, that's just the knickknacks that we consume in a very concrete way and enjoy, you just can't flatten things into this single dimension. And I think a really simple way to see that is to just say, okay, let's say we only had one consumption good, horse. Okay, so we're in the golden horde, something, one of the empires that followed Genghis Khan's when it split up. And, they got a lot of use out of their horses. They could ride them, but they could also, use their skin and their milk and everything. And let's say they could only consume horses. The quality of the consumption basket that they got to enjoy, it rises as the number of horses rises. Like, you'd rather have 5 horses than 1, but it only rises toward a ceiling. And that ceiling is below what a typical, like, modern middle class American gets to enjoy. And so whatever number you put to consumption or GDP in the horse economy, if your index is going to be like homogeneous of degree 1, like if it's going to have the natural feature that if you double all the stuff in it, then you double the number you assign to consumption. So if you've got 5 horses, right, and then you go from that to 10 horses, then you've doubled consumption, right? Whatever number you put to how much consumption 5 horses counts for, as horses goes to infinity, consumption is going to rise to infinity, but the quality of the consumption basket's still going to be below what's presumably the finite consumption basket that the middle class American gets.
And the issue is, no matter how many loaves of bread that I have in 1800, it doesn't matter, because I would swap no number of loaves of bread for my modern day laptop.
Yeah, I mean, or at least it's totally possible to have that preference. Yeah, I think that's a common preference. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was this previous paper that I think you were involved in together with Leopold Aschenbrenner on whether or not we could try to speed through the time of perils. So relating existential risk and growth. What does this imply for that?
Yeah, this paper and some recent papers by Chad Jones, they all are centered around this calculation of how much consumption we might be willing to sacrifice for safety over time as we get richer. And the assumption is that as we get richer, our marginal utility in consumption falls, because we've got these concave utility functions, and so and we have more to lose if we die, because we're better, we're doing better and better. And so for both reasons, we'll be willing to sacrifice more consumption for safety over time. And if that effect is strong enough, it could mean that we're willing to tolerate really rapid AI development, which could get out of hand and be disruptive or even existentially catastrophic. Right now, we're willing to take that risk, but in the future, we won't be, at least if we survive to a future where we're rich enough to kind of want to make the trade-off the other way. I think that argument probably has a fair bit of truth to it. It's not just a theoretical point that as we get richer, we get willing to sacrifice a lot of consumption for safety. We see it in medicine being a luxury good. As people get richer and as societies get richer, we spend not just more on medicine, but a larger fraction of our incomes on medicine. On the other hand, these trends can reverse. So, healthcare spending as a fraction of GDP actually has, I think, fallen a bit in the U.S. in recent years and in other advanced countries. And, you never, it's always very easy to kind of predict a trend correctly right before it turns around for one reason or another. But the deeper issue with kind of putting too much stock in this argument is that, as we were just saying, in principle, as new goods get introduced, they can cause the relationship between our wealth, broadly construed, and our willingness to sacrifice consumption for safety to go the other way. New products can kind of start making us willing to sacrifice less consumption for safety because the consumption tastes so damn good, right? Now, again, on balance, historically, I think this effect has tended not to win out. But if AI kind of nudges the direction of technological development so that, we're getting more copies of the old things, and so we're kind of satiating in those. But we're inventing these new things that that are really desirable, like because they're like immortality pills, or they're wires to the head that just give you mind blowing joy or something. Then it's like totally consistent with a reasonable looking utility function to just be like the rat pushing the heroin button or something, and getting more expected utility out of a path that involves more short-term pleasure, but a lot of it, and a higher chance of disaster than the safer path. At least for like a non-negligible discount rate. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that that growth is more in the kind of satiating, safety promoting direction in the near future, because I care about the distant, the distant future and getting to it. But it's at least a logical possibility that it goes the other way. And I think, this is sort of related to some of the stuff we were talking about before, but yeah, I think we can be led astray, and I certainly have been led astray by kind of doubling down too hard on a simple, like, one-dimensional model of things, in which basically all that automation or AI can do is like speed us up or slow us down on some trajectory that's already set in stone. There's lots of different sort of dimensions of technological development and paths we could go down, and by speeding up, one a bit more than the others relative to how fast they've been proceeding relative to each other in the past, a lot of our intuitions might break.
Moving on to the gate model, a core part of this model is the amount of production that you get, and is determined strongly by the fraction of tasks that are automated. So there's this question, though, about whether or not this framing even makes sense. So I'm curious what you think about that. Like, does the fraction of tasks, like as like the framing for these growth models, hold much water? Or doesn't really make that much sense?
Yeah, I think they qualitatively they can be pretty insightful, and I don't want to say the whole approach is worthless or anything like that, but certainly I don't currently think they're as useful as I used to think. For starters, I just I think it's sort of telling the very first task-based model in a form anything like we know them today was Xera's in 1998, and it came out right when the ONET task database of like U.S. occupations was was first put out, I think, in 1997, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it's like, well, people collected all this data thinking might as well, it could be useful for something, and people come up with a model that makes use of this data. If we collected other data, we probably would have come up with some other model. I don't think there's a deep fact that like work subdivides into these nuggets that we call tasks, and that we can sort of think about plowing through one by one and seeing what happens to growth. A simple example of how that can go wrong was explained to me by Pamela Mishkin at OpenAI, who was one of the co-authors on this paper that makes heavy use of a task-based model. This is GPTs or GPTs, which Drone Acemoglu wrote a paper kind of making use of their estimates of automatability by LLMs by task. And yeah, it just seems like this really rich sort of resource. And so I and some other people where I'm working at Stanford, or at least we were, and I think we are still, but trying to follow up on that. And talked to Pamela, and she was like, oh, this whole framework doesn't really make much sense anyway. And what do you mean? And she sent me an email explaining it, and I didn't get it. So then we had a Zoom call, And this was her example. Let's say I've got 2 tasks. Write an email to this moron Phil, she didn't put it that way, who write an email to him explaining the limitations of a task-based model. Task B is have a Zoom call with Phil going through the limitations of a task-based model in more detail. If all she had to do was task A, maybe an LLM could have done it better and faster. But given that task B is coming, she felt, and it could be the case, that if the LLM can't do task B, have the Zoom call, it would take her more time to read and internalize and remember the particular choices of terminology that the LLM would produce in the email so that we can discuss it on common terms over the Zoom call, right? Instead of her having to keep going back and saying, wait, what's Phil getting at? Oh, yeah, the LLM used this term for something. That would take more time. So given that task B is coming, the most efficient workflow is for her to be the one that writes the email, right? So like an eval or just a human like evaluation of a given ONet task on like whether an LLM can do the task would predict that, if someone's job consists of task A and task B, and then we introduce an LLM that you found could do task A, that their productivity would double, right? They could just do task B all day. They'd get twice as much of it done. Maybe half of them would be fired. I mean, it depends on the GE effect or whatever, but like that, right? But actually, it would have no effect at all in this case, right? Everyone would just keep on doing task A. So if these sorts of effects are significant enough, I think that means that our projections from task-based models could be wrong in kind of at least 3 big ways. So one is that the growth impacts of automating technologies, including LLMs or AI in general, could be delayed relative to what you naively would have thought, because it's got to automate A and B before you see any of the effects, right? Second bias is that when they come, they'll be more sudden than you would have thought. And the third, more sort of subtly, gets back to this latency thing. I know, this is what I'm thinking about all the time now, so I have to work it into everything. The message of Pamela's example is that there's a kind of increasing returns to scale, and that like it's more productive to have the same mind doing tasks A and B. And that might outweigh the fact that if you tried to outsource task A kind of in isolation, this alternative system could way more, efficiently or quickly or something perform task A, right? Despite that, it's so beneficial. There's a kind of a positive spillover, right, where doing task A makes the factor of production, in this case, her body and brain, more productive at task B. And that positive spillover is so big that it totally, displaces the use of the LLM in task A. Okay, well, we can currently take advantage of these sort of positive spillovers, or these cases of learning by doing from like concrete task to concrete task. We can take advantage of them up to the size of a given human's capacity for work. Some kinds of work maybe can be subdivided. There's just something you can just take out of your day and sort of ask someone else to do. But not that much. And so what that's telling us is that we have these spillovers where it's like really helpful to have the same mind doing all the different things. And we can take advantage of the increasing returns that this allows for, but only up to the size of like what a single person can do in a day or in a year or in a life. And so, with just sort of bigger systems with like really big neural nets that can do a lot of things simultaneously and have really big memories that can use the learning they got from writing that email to Joe 6 years ago, in on the other side of the world, to inform the Zoom call that they have with Phil about task-based models tomorrow. You would expect to see even more growth than you would predict from a naive task-based model, where the best you can do is just automate all the tasks one by one, and then kind of get a world that in which sort of everyone was still the same size.
Yeah, is this not a question, though, of whether or not the tasks and ONets happen to be at the right level of abstraction? Like, couldn't I, say, make an argument about how, for example, if we look at which occupations existed in the past during the Industrial Revolution, like before the Industrial Revolution, and we compare that to the tasks of today, like indeed, like maybe a large fraction of those jobs, like using the precursor to ONet, like that would it have been so bad that it's like just totally useless? I guess you're not saying that this is totally useless, but then is this not just a question of ONet being at the wrong level of abstraction?
I see what you're saying. So it's a few things. One is, if we're talking about gate in particular, one thing it can do in kind of a best case scenario is be improved on over time as data comes in. And so we could see like, oh, it looks like this is the function from like model size to fraction of tasks automatable or whatever, right? And if we're looking at the occupation level and there's only like 3, then it's just not going to be useful like that. And you're going to have to turn to other ways of indexing our progress. Like you could like rebench or whatever, like the task time length growing or whatever, but you're not going to be able to use ONet because like the right level of granularity is just unreasonably large. On the other hand, I mean, I don't think there's like one objective right level of granularity, because for some purposes, like with A and B, right, it could be that some people have questions that need follow-up emails that don't require follow-up Zoom calls, right? And you want to be able to capture the fact that Pamela is going to be able to just ask the LLM to handle those. So I don't know. My lesson is more just like you've got to be careful when thinking about your application of a task-based model, rather than that there is a right task-based model, but it's just at a coarser level of granularity or something.
I think that's very much the kind of thing that I was trying to get at, which is like, if I'm trying to do this like coding task, maybe like the description at like ONet level would look more like doing coding, doing data visualization, but then really the thing that we actually care about is more like it's able to write this particular block of code in this Python notebook, or it's able to write this Python script. And what I meant by like level of abstraction was like, maybe we need to actually step down to a different thing that's more amenable to capturing that kind of automation. So it's like less a problem of like the framing of a fraction of tasks, but maybe it's more like, just like the particular data that we have, the things that we're trying to use to measure these things are quickly becoming out of date. Maybe in the same way that like the precursor to ONets was out of date and they had to come up with a new thing.
When you say it's quickly becoming out of date, do you mean just because like the nature of work is changing fast, or do you mean that like it's becoming out of date because day to day the list of tasks that you're doing is different? Because like, code this particular thing is different from code that particular thing.
I think it's becoming out of date in the sense of we are getting a better sense of what kinds of tasks AI is automating over time. And maybe in the past, we just like didn't really have this like understanding. Now we're realizing more and more just how off like these task descriptions might be compared to the actual task automation progression.
I see. Yeah, okay. So like we should cut things up in a way that corresponds more closely to how we think like things will actually unfold, so that things will be cleaner, where it can like fully do A, B, and C before it can even do a little bit of D. Kind of.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that would be the hope, but then I think it's also kind of hard to do that. Like I'm not sure how I would cut things up.
Yeah, no, it's a good thought. I haven't thought about how we might categorize tasks in a way that's more amenable to tracking AI automatability.
Okay, so speaking of the gate model, would you say that the biggest problem with the gate model or the greatest source of uncertainty is coming from the AI R&D module, or do you think it's actually not just that?
Well, I can only speak for myself. I think the biggest source of uncertainty is the assumption that there's some amount of compute where we can be confident that a model trained with that much compute would be able to fully automate, anything in particular, and that secondly, that we can interpolate between here and there, such that with the kind of 20% of the compute to the threshold to the finish line, we could automate whatever percent of the tasks. Right. This isn't an issue with gate in particular. It's inherited from Tom's takeoff speeds model, I think, but it would be really nice to have a threshold like that, right, where we could say, okay, we know we'll get to AGI or to a system that can automate AI R&D or that can do something else you're interested in, and then the interpolation just seems totally made up. But I've never thought that whole methodology was very well grounded.
I think the interpolation indeed is pretty made up. I guess the issue is just what do we do instead?
Well, I'll tell you. I mean, we can't do it now, right? But I think it will start to be the case that full-on ONET tasks will be automated, and full-on sub classifications of work time, certain types of eventually whole occupations, but before that, categories of from time use surveys or from timesheets, whatever, that they'll start to be eliminated, and then we'll have the data to extrapolate rather than interpolate, right? Instead of assuming a finish line and then putting a point in the middle and then fitting a curve, we'll be able to say, every time we double the model size, we tend to, cut the remaining ONET tasks in half, or whatever the relationship will look like. At the moment, there's that GPTs or GPTs paper. They just ask an LLM for its guesses about what it could do, right? And then, they have people kind of try to judge it, but they adjust the prompt that they give the LLM to kind of match the people, and then they extrapolate. In principle, for anything, the people, whatever, there's a whole long conversation. But so even if you fully trust those estimates, that's sort of a single data point, right? That's what GPT-4 could automate, how partially it could automate each ONET task. People haven't done a follow-up one for GPT-5 or whatever, or for a reasoning model. They haven't recapitulated the whole methodology of that paper. The Anthropic Economic Index and other data on LLM usage that's starting to come out from the other providers might let us sort of continuously start to do this sort of extrapolation. And they're not just anchoring on ONET tasks, right? Like Anthropic, but they also have their own categorizations that might sort of cluster more naturally, right? They have this endogenous clustering thing where they apply some ML to try to figure out kind of what people are using the models for.
Right.
And that's kind of maybe responding to your point about how we can sort of create on the fly a way of carving up work into tasks that kind of better corresponds to automatability. That approach will have its flaws as well, but I think from at least a certain perspective, it'll be more grounded than the sort of set end point and then interpolate approach that we've been having to make use of so far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it's still early stages for that. And in a really fast takeoff scenario, then there won't be time, right? Because we'll move so quickly from being able to automate almost nothing to being able to automate everything at once. So maybe it's just intrinsically hard to predict. But yeah, I think probably not. I think probably we will be able to start doing kind of extrapolations that are a bit more empirical as time goes on, and as we start kind of developing a track record of like automating tasks completely. So of course you can track progress and start to extrapolate in this sort of more empirical way, not just by looking at the dimension of tasks, but by looking at task time length, right? So Meter have their famous study of this. And I think that's just great. That's amazing, because it's sort of like the first real example of starting to do what we would have liked to be able to do all along. Track progress on something that in principle would eventually get you to full automation of at least some class of tasks, and we're far enough along already that we can draw a line through the data that we have and sort of make an extrapolation. It's not like we just have like 1 or 2 data points right at the beginning, like maybe with ONet. You might be able to carve up the space of work or the space of R&D or the space of AI R&D in other ways as well. So I think situational awareness has been criticized by some for being as hand wavy as it is about the kind of extrapolation by equivalent to human age, basically, right? Like as smart as a high schooler, as smart as a college student. And yeah, I mean, I think that framing is not justified in that essay, but it could be, or something like it could be. It could be that more experienced workers are paid a lot more than more junior workers. If you need to know one thing about a person to predict their wages, right? Even more than education or race or gender or whatever, like age explains so much. And what that's telling us is that there's just like a lot of tacit knowledge that the people accrue through life. Well, okay, so maybe the way things will unfold is that AIs first get good at learning the sorts of things you can learn from books, which they have access to no less than a college student. In fact, they have better access in some sense. And so the people right out of college with no kind of tacit experience will be first automated, and then kind of as they start to get more sample efficient and or they're deployed for longer, and in those kind of early stage roles that they kind of accumulate the data, that means that they can displace the people that had only had 3 years of real world experience. And then you could see that creeping up maybe. I'm not saying that's what's happening. You hear anecdotes, of course, about young software engineers finding it harder to get jobs or whatever. But like it could be that a story along the lines sketched out in situational awareness comes to have like an empirical grounding, in which case we'll have this other way to extrapolate, right? Mm-hmm. And there might be others as well that I haven't thought of.
I guess it reminds me of like AI 2027, where they're kind of using like this meter data for forecasting the timeline to a superhuman coder.
Yeah.
As far as I understand. And then instead of just doing this for like a superhuman coder, which I guess makes the most sense given what kinds of tasks were included in the meter study, perhaps we could try to generalize this somehow by getting like more data, or just generalizing the study to a broader fraction of tasks in the economy.
Yeah, but still looking at task length.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that would be another. That would be kind of expanding the scope of that particular dimension, the task length dimension. Right.
Mm-hmm. How much should we update on economic theory anyway?
Yep. That's a profound question. Something I've had to wrestle with, having sort of specialized in it. Definitely less than I used to think. this is sort of a pessimistic view, but a view I've somewhat come around to is that economic theory is primarily a destructive project. And what I mean by that, I mean, well,
Doesn't sound promising.
well, yeah, but it's not so bad. What I mean is, if it's good for anything, it's most useful for pointing out that intuitions that you might have had don't actually hold in general. Okay, sort of coming up with counterexamples or sort of curious models in which something you thought was inevitable turns out not to hold. And every now and then, on further investigation, hopefully empirical investigation, you'll find that this theoretical curiosity is actually relevant. So it can sort of open your mind. But it's a much more limited role than like being able to actually like deduce the truth from first principles, right? I mean, just sort of a classic example is like minimum wages, right? You'll see people saying, as an economist, I know X, and whatever. When the price of something goes up, people want less of it, and so minimum wage is going to cause unemployment. That's not something you know as an economist. That's something you know as a shopper or something. Everyone kind of has the intuition that typically when things get more expensive, they'll be less demanded. You didn't need a PhD to learn that. If you learned anything in a PhD, either it was the tools to empirically test whether that's true in some context, the just fact about whether it's true in some context, because you did actually apply the tools, or the theoretical insight that it's not true by necessity. So it turns out that there are such things as Giffen goods, or you can very commonly have backward sloping supply curves for labor, because if someone gets paid more, they might just work fewer hours, right? Sort of buy back their own leisure with some of the money, and so labor markets can look all sorts of ways from first principles. So this theory can shake you out of this kind of intuition that you might have had walking into Econ 101 or walking out of Econ 101. And I think the empirical case on minimum wages is just it's sort of messy, and it in some cases they do probably cause some unemployment, in other cases not, and it depends a lot on the magnitudes and all the rest of it. But I'm just there's some people who triumphantly say economics is wrong, minimum wages don't cause unemployment. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I think if economic theory has anything to add there, it's destructive of the common sense intuition we all have about prices and quantities that we know from everyday life. And so generally when thinking about AI and growth, I mean there's some constructive points, the Jones model can, at least sort of to some extent, if you squint, explain the past. And so it can serve as a nice basis where you can swap out the L's with K's and see what full automation would do to growth. But beyond that, I think it doesn't have that much to add, even though I'm trying to add a little bit. And if it does have something to add, it's by identifying ways in which the future could be surprising, which then we'll have to just kind of look into more kind of with whatever empirical tools we have.
So I guess like some of the ways in which you've applied this are to say things like, what is the impact of AGI on the probability of explosive growth and on wages? And my understanding is that you thought that it's kind of ambiguous, just from like a purely theoretical perspective. I'm curious, like, if that's right, and also like whether you think you have like a different perspective if you take all of the empirical evidence into account. Like, what's your overall view, and what's like your purely theory? Like, let's try to find like the counterexamples view.
Yeah, well, it's all a little bit mixed together, but so to say, one thing that I think definitely is in this, like, here's a theoretical curiosity point, is that real GDP is such a bizarre like chimera of a variable that you could have full automation and really explosive growth in every intuitive sense of the term, and yet like real GDP growth could go down even. An example of why it might at least not go up that much, which I think it probably won't all kind of work out this way, but I don't think this is crazy, is that you get this effect where, so there's this common pattern you find where new goods, just as they're introduced, have a really small GDP share because they have zero GDP share before they're introduced, right? They at first they're really expensive. We're not very productive at making them, and as the price comes down, as we get more productive, the price falls, but the quantity rises faster, right? So the elasticity of demand, I always get this backwards. The elasticity of demand is greater than 1. Yeah. Every time the price falls a little bit, the quantity rises a lot. So the dollar value of the good rises, right? So the share is rising. And after a while, it goes the other way. Once the good's really abundant, at least relative to everything else, every time we have the price, the quantity only rises a little bit because we're basically satiated in it. So you get this hump. New goods, small share. Goods that have been around for a medium length of time that we're mediumly productive at, high share. They dominate GDP. Old goods, like food, small share. And so we're kind of continually like going through this hump. So everyone's familiar with Baumol's cost disease, but the way it's usually presented is that AI might have less of an effect on growth than you might have thought, because we'll be bottlenecked by the few things that have not yet been automated that you still need people for. And actually, you can have Baumol after full automation, because so remember the hump, right? So like real GDP growth at a given time is the weighted average of the growth rates of all the goods, where the weightings are the GDP shares. The GDP shares will be dominated by the goods that we're intermediately productive at in this view, right? So let's say for every good, you have like its own specific technology growth rate, like how quickly it can be produced, is some arbitrary function of its current technology level. Okay, so it can be hyperbolic. You can have a dot equals a squared, something. So for every good, there is some finite date by which we'll be able to produce infinite quantities of it in finite time. So it'll be free. So GDP share will be 0, and it'll, and we just go through these ever higher indexed goods, ever more complex goods over time, and at any given time, like all of GDP are the goods that have like a productivity level of like 5 or whatever happens to be in the middle, as far as GDP shares go. So some effect like that can produce something like a Baumol effect even after full automation. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be pretty weird if that kept the absolute number low, like anything as low as like the current number, sort of indefinitely. But yeah, the idea that like maybe it causes measured, real GDP growth to not be that high for a while when the world's starting to look remarkably different. That doesn't seem crazy to me, and maybe it's worth knowing and just kind of having as a scenario in your back pocket in case things start looking weird and anyone says, what are you talking about? I don't see it in the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's you know what I mean. So it's kind of what I'm trying to be cautious and all, but like that's an example of like destructive
Yeah.
economic theory.
Do we have any like quantitative sense like what the hump looks like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, again, there's that Besson paper, and you could just do a bunch of case studies, you know, by good. Yeah, I should look into that more quantitatively.
Okay. And then kind of to go back to like the thing of like, what's your overall view then?
Oh, I didn't get to the wages either. I should say something about the wages.
Sure.
But yeah, I don't know. My overall view on what?
The probability of explosive growth over the next, say, 5 decades.
I think like if by explosive you mean like an order of magnitude higher than now, that I think is more likely than not. I mean, with 25 years of 30% growth, the world's very different. You know, it's you know, in fact, I was just punching in the numbers on my phone on the way here. It's so 25 years of 30% growth is things are so different that even our intuition that you can do 1.3 to the 25 or you can do e to the 0.3 times 25 will be about the same. That's broken down. So 1.3 to the 25 is 700. The world economy is 700 times bigger in some sense. E to the 0.3 times 25 is 1800, right? So just like the additional compounding from like, you know, continuous growth at annualized 30% a year, more than doubles the number. Anyway, so in a world that different, you know, yeah, some funky effect where we're like bottlenecked by these new goods, which will be really advanced, right? Because they'll be like, you know, some weird nanobot type thing that like, you know, whatever. It takes a lot of, you know, serial steps to create, and we need it to. We can't make up for a lack of it with large quantities of all the goods that we've been able to produce in the meantime, and so we're kind of like bottlenecked by the scarcity of this new thing. But anyway, some weird effect like that, or some natural resource constraint, or some regulatory imposition. You know, like maybe we really do satiate, and we start wanting to just really make the world very safe and stable, even if it means throttling growth to only 30% a year or whatever. All of that, all of that roughly cancels out to me at the moment. I think with the counter arguments, which are also valid, that, you know, due to international competition, then, you know, people will continue to race with each other for military purposes, even if they would prefer each to be safer, or the whatever. So that's where about where I land. I'm kind of even odds once you press too far beyond order of magnitude.
And how much like does your answer change if we don't consider the economic theory like aspects of this, and we don't consider those like you know, the hump of like the productivities and like shares, like would your answer change much?
Oh, sorry. I should have said before. I mean, 50 years is long enough that I do think we'll be able to develop robots and, you know, AIs that can do what we can do. But some of the uncertainty will also just be that doesn't work out, right? And then, yeah, it's a little hard to separate it out. I mean, digging into the theory of just like you know, what chain weighting is and so on has made me pretty viscerally feel like real GDP is a much slipperier concept than I ever used to think, right? I mean, here's a fun fact. This is crazy. So real GDP and lots of real variables, like inflation adjusted variables, real capital or whatever. Let's say real GDP is not a quantity. And what do I mean? Yeah, it's not. Here's what I mean. Imagine a timeline of some economy. So the US from 1950 to 2025, 75 years.
Okay.
And imagine an alternative timeline with an alternative economy living it out. That's exactly the same as the US in 1950 at the beginning, in its own 1950, and exactly like the US in 2025 at the end, in year 75. But in the middle, things happened in a different order.
Oh, okay.
Right? So the microwave was invented in 2006 and the iPhone came out in 1971, and the distribution of wealth changed hands. It just it evolved in a different way. But at the end, it's exactly the same. Everyone's got the same preferences, exchanges the same goods and services for the same dollar bills, atom for atom. Everything unfolds exactly the same in 2025 and in 1950 on both timelines, okay? Timeline A, timeline B. Unless people have homothetic preferences, meaning that the fraction of their income they spend on each good is constant no matter how rich they are. So no like luxuries or inferior goods, which is completely wrong, right? Like you don't spend the same fraction on food when you're starving as when you're rich. But unless people have homothetic preferences that are the exact same preferences across the population and totally stable over time, unless those three conditions are met, there is a timeline B on which real GDP growth, chain weighted across the years with perfect measurement, is any number.
Okay.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
So I mean, even the fact that there could be any variation means that, to my mind, real GDP is not a quantity because it's like baking in the history. You see what I'm saying? Like you want to be like a yardstick shouldn't matter the order in which you measure things. Like it should like order things in the same way, right? But the order in which things happen can change what share of GDP a given good was while it was growing quickly, right? So let's say there's two of us, and one of us is going to be rich one year and the other one's going to be rich the other year. And the stuff that I like more, I'm going to bid up the price, whatever. I've got a lot of clones that have my preferences, and you've got a lot of clones. We bid up the price more of the things we like when we're rich. So if the way things happen is that the things we like are growing quickly in just absolute units, while we happen to have the money, so our preferences are like kind of mostly determining what GDP is. And the things you like are growing quickly when you and your clones have the money. Real GDP it's going to be higher across the 2 years than if it's the other way, right? Where the things I like grow when I'm poor, and vice versa, right? And it's that kind of effect that can mean that you can scramble things up so that as long as people depart from perfect homotheticity, constant preferences, same across the population, you can. Real GDP can be any number. So maybe I've over-internalized this, but given that I've over-internalized this, I sort of feel like I can't separate the theory from the overall opinion, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it's like a funny way of framing it though. Like I think I would still call it a quantity, but it's just like it depends on the history. Because like I mean, in like maybe in physics, we could say like the work done is not a function of state. It's not just like, these are the things that you have, and it's only determined by that. It also depends on like the path it took, like historically. But then there are also like other quantities that are just like dependent on the state. It's kind of like the internal energy or something.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of like a word choice though. I don't think that really makes a difference to your core claim. So a new topic. How do we detect the economic singularity?
Okay. Yeah, that's a big one. I don't have anything super original, but I have something a little bit original. So William Nordhaus, this Nobel Prize winning economist, has a paper from 2021 asking, are we approaching an economic singularity? And his answer was no, because he observed that if we were, we would see a bunch of macroeconomic variables moving in sort of predictable directions. So we would see like the capital share rising, for instance. I mean, I think that's just the most robust one. If we're approaching a world of full automation where we've got these robots and computers that can do everything people can do, and there's just more of them, the share of income paid to their owners has to be higher than the share paid to labor, and it's got to grow ever higher as their relative quantity increases. But other examples like that. So he then kind of like plots these things and finds that, they're all kind of as flat as they ever were. So he says the singularity is not near. And methodologically, I think that that's a great insight. It can be, so the issue with it is that it can be a really lagging indicator of whether we're, like, it basically just tells us, is a singularity underway?
Yeah.
And, it's sort of like, it's like being a weather forecaster and just sort of looking out the window and saying whether it's raining. But I mean, if you start to see all of them moving in the same direction a little bit, that should be an update. And it'll only be super lagging on the most fully, like, software intelligence explosion comes first, then it starts to impact the real economy very discreetly later, sort of scenario, which I think is like a possible scenario, but it's good to know that in other scenarios you can extract some real information from the macroeconomic variables well in advance. So anyway, so Nordhaus did that. One very small thing I've done is just get the analyses up to date and expand on them a little bit, add a few kind of similar variables to the list, and find that they're all just as flat as they were when Nordhaus measured them.
I guess that's not that surprising.
Which is not surprising, but it's, I can report that on Nordhaus's methodology, we're not seeing any more evidence than we did in 2021 or 2015 when he first wrote the paper, actually. A sort of subtler thing is that you can look at what's called a network-adjusted capital share. The network-adjusted capital share is a feature of a good. So the capital share is a feature of an economy, right? What fraction of all income is received in exchange for the use of capital? Network-adjusted capital share asks, for every dollar of revenue spent on that good, if you trace it all the way back down the supply chain, how much of it is paid out in exchange for value added by capital, as opposed to value added by labor or taxes?
So what was the thing that we're tracing?
A dollar of revenue.
Okay.
So, for example, Starbucks sells a cup of coffee. You give them $5. Some of it is paid to the people working at Starbucks. So, maybe 20 cents, say, or let's say $1. Some of it is received as profits by the people who own the physical infrastructure of Starbucks and the brand, the shareholders of Starbucks. Let's say that's another $1. And let's put aside taxes. And $3 are spent on intermediate inputs, say. I'm making up these numbers, but so it's on the coffee beans and the cups and the electricity to keep the lights on and all that. Now, as far as the Starbucks balance sheet is concerned, those are capital expenses. But in reality, they're not all capital expenses because we haven't traced them down the chain. You've got to ask, of every dollar they get in revenue for coffee beans, how much goes to the owners of the firm for just owning the capital of the firm, how much goes to the people working at the firm for their labor, and how much is spent on intermediate inputs that that firm uses. Like if it's a farm, then the tractor or something. And then, okay, for every dollar they give the tractor, they give John Deere, how much is spent on capital, labor, and intermediate inputs at John Deere. And so, yeah, so of that original $5 that you gave, you can, in principle, ask like, okay, it's all ultimately going to capital or labor, like all the way down the supply chain. I mean, it in some sense it never ends, right? But just like you're cutting up the pennies ever smaller. That if you're going to try to do this like manually, you'd have to sort of stop after a while, right? But you can say, okay, yeah, what's the capital kind of contribution in some sense to this cup of coffee as opposed to the labor? Okay. So the reason this is relevant is, so one neat thing is that it sounds totally intractable to compute. There's this A.J. Jacobs book in which he, A.J. Jacobs?
No.
He writes these sort of funky books in which he does some sort of stunt and writes about it. And in one of them, he tried to thank everyone in the world for his cup of coffee, right? So at the beginning, he's thanking the barista, but, a few chapters in, and he's like thanking the people who, made the paint for the truck that carried the whatever. And I mean, I haven't read the book, but that's my understanding. So yeah, it sounds intractable. It turns out the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis and the OECD similarly create these big input-output tables every year where they actually try to figure out, relatively coarsely, but still at a level of granularity of like 87 industries or something, I think it is, how much of every dollar of revenue goes to, for like an average firm in that industry, goes to the immediate labor capital and then all the intermediate inputs across all the other industries. So you got a big matrix. And it turns out that you can work out what the network adjusted capital share is for any item in the matrix with some matrix inversion and stuff. You kind of do that infinite sort of tracing down the chain. And then you can plot what that is over time for any given good. Okay. You might want to know if a good is approaching having a network adjusted capital share of 1 for a few reasons, right? One is that, yeah, so if it's the kind of good that can later drive the growth of everything else, right? If it's like semiconductors or whatever, if we've like fully automated semiconductor production, we think that will then drive the intelligence explosion, which drives, the automation of other things. This will actually be more of a leading indicator, right? You'll actually be able to do some weather forecasting instead of just looking out the window. But secondly, you might just be interested in it because, like, if a good has a network adjusted capital share of 1, everyone on Earth could die, and it would still keep getting cranked out, right? And yeah, I mean that's the kind of thing that could just have a big effect on the world and all sorts. We could have having self-replicating, in some sense, in this sort of grand supply chain sense, having self-replicating drones would be really important for military purposes, right? Or like robocops or something. If you no longer need the support of your population to have the equipment to suppress them, maybe dictatorship will be more stable. So, or if some omnicidal maniac wants to create little, killer machines that can self-replicate. That'll all, I mean, people can intervene to shut it down or something, but there's at least, you've crossed some threshold of it being more worrying when, you have a closed loop in which no one needs to actively intervene to like create the, to keep the system going, which then leaves its mark on the world. So anyway, so I just thought that would be kind of interesting. Just, compute that, invert that matrix, and look at that network adjusted capital share for different goods over time. And it turns out they're all basically as flat as a board. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, for semiconductors, that's not at the industry level that's computed annually. It's only every 5 years, unfortunately. So it's always really out of date. But yeah, it's like 50-50. It's sort of always been 50-50. So there you go. So yet one more little data point that maybe the singularity is not near, at least sort of if it's going to be an industrially intense singularity early on.
I'm curious, like, if we kind of went back in time here and then we tried to like apply like a similar style of thinking to whether or not we could have detected the Industrial Revolution happening. Like, suppose we went to like 1700 in France and we tried to detect the Industrial Revolution coming in advance with some kind of leading indicator. Like, what would people have done? Like, how well would you have done?
Yeah, I mean, in practice, I think the people at the time would not have done well.
Yeah.
I mean, even if they'd kind of known to keep an eye out for something like that. I do want to share a bit about the economists of 1700s France, the physiocrats, they were called. They created the first of those input-output tables, at least I think, as far as we know, that the BEA now studiously collects every year or 5 years, and in some ways they had some sort of free market thoughts, which Adam Smith incorporated into Wealth of Nations, and but they also had this crazy idea, at least a lot of them did, that the real wealth came from the earth. It came from the land, and everything else that people do, that's just some icing on the cake. That's rearranging the wood into a chair and stuff. And like, yeah, you got to do that down the line, but like to really get more wealth, you've got to speed up what the beginning of the pipeline. And so all this moves to the cities, and all those first glimmers of industrialization, they were all moving the wrong way. So everyone had to get back to the countryside for economic growth. It's like the worst possible advice you can imagine, and maybe an early example of economic theory gone awry. But anyway, yeah, I think the things to do would have been first to look around for what's going on in other countries. So sort of an obvious example, but don't assume that what's happening in France is the best guide to what will be happening in France in a few decades or in a century or something. Likewise, yeah, I was just looking at, I'm sort of realizing my own folly as I'm speaking, but I was looking at the US for all these network adjusted capital shares. But there are other countries like Japan where there's a fair bit more automation, at least in a lot of sectors. And because that demonstrates that something's feasible, that means that even if for whatever reason it's not been implemented here, it might come very quickly, as industrialization kind of came over the English Channel a bit later.
So one question that I have about explosive growth is that a lot of the framing is usually around like, increasing the number of AI researchers. But you also mentioned that there are these kinds of like other returns to scale. So the framing I want to take here is like, what exactly already returns to tacit knowledge? So in particular, suppose you could either 10x the human population, and then on the one hand, and on the other hand, you could allow all humans to share all of their tacit knowledge with each other. So like, which do you think would have a bigger effect on economic growth, and what would that look like? Is this like a growth effect, like in the long run, if we maintain this? Is like, is there some kind of level effect here? How do you expect this to work out?
I expect that doubling the population would have a bigger effect on growth. I mean, again, mind you, the increasing returns to scale that specialization could allow for, or just like better coordination through one person's knowledge immediately being accessed by another. That's something that we, on some level, have been improving on over time, right? I mean, not that quickly, but like, as I mentioned, I think, the invention of the internet and modern, telecommunications and just all the academic infrastructure we have for like quickly, sharing papers and even on the tacit knowledge front. I think we've been getting better at communicating over time, and if that's had an effect, it's been small enough that we've been able to not be like completely crazy when sort of talking about the economy in really broad brushstrokes. Even proposing that like it's a significant source of increasing returns to scale, such that with these big brained AIs, they'll 10x AI is gonna be a lot more productive than 10 smaller ones. I think it's true, but like the idea that this would be such a large effect that it would outweigh the raw like replication effect that with 10 times more people you'd have kind of at baseline a 10 times larger economy. And here the replication argument does work, mind you, right? Because like with 10 times more people with the same tastes, you're gonna make 10 times as much stuff because you're gonna I think I'd be very surprised if this effect of like kind of mind melding or whatever was big enough to outweigh the full on like elasticity of one, like double the population, double output replication point. But I don't know. I mean, obviously we'd be really pushing the boundary to develop AIs that could like immediately share all their tacit knowledge. But actually there is another kind of way you can shed some light on this, which is just by looking at the returns to working longer hours, right? So something I've sort of been interested in is like, why exactly is it that in some professions you make so much more by working really long hours, as a lawyer or whatever, and you'll have, or an early investment banker or something, you'll have people working like 80-hour weeks, and that's really miserable. And you think, well, why can't you just get a normal job where you're working like a 40-hour week but get paid half as much, but actually get paid less than half as much, or the job's not available at all? And I mean, sure, there's some just like genuine workaholics who would want to work that much, but I think there are people for whom it sort of feels suboptimal. And the reason why that's what we end up doing, it's got to be because of the sort of increasing returns to scale thing, where it's more productive to have this breadth of tasks associated with a project located in a single brain. And if you can't all get it into a single person, then you make do with as few as you can, so that you can have all the integration of the disparate parts of the project. So that's kind of like sharing tacit knowledge with one other person. It's just yourself for like another work week crammed into the same work week. I mean, the CRS view, the constant returns to scale view, would say that working 80 hours gets you twice the salary, or less if you're kind of overworked or something. And the increasing returns to scale view says that it gets you more than twice the salary, right? Mm-hmm. And it does. But it doesn't get you more than 4 times the salary. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the primary effect is, I think, just the fact that you're working more hours.
Is that the case though? Like, I guess like in this case, like, I wonder how comparable it is. Like if we have like, say, we're really sharing the tacit knowledge across the entire economy, like of all the possible like agents in this economy, and it feels like potentially a lot bigger than just like sharing with one person, like, and stuffing it within the same week.
It's a good point. It's a good point. I would want to I would wonder how much everyone needs everyone else's tacit knowledge, right? Because
Right.
to a large extent, we're just doing jobs that require independent knowledge bases. But I can't rule it out. Maybe someone knows something that rules it out. But
Hmm.
I definitely take the point that it might be a bit bigger than the like investment banker returns to scale. But
Okay.
it's a lower bound. Intuitively for me, it's something close to an upper bound. But I don't have more to say about that.
So which is going to be more valuable if we consider the thought experiment of 2 half Jupyter brains versus a single Jupyter brain? Which one would be more valuable?
So we all know that having twice as many people leads to kind of more than twice as much output through agglomeration, like people cluster in cities nowadays almost entirely because of each other, not because of some like natural resource, some port or something that the city happens to be next to. And so everyone gets to go to their own favorite like kind of barber and eat at their own favorite kind of restaurant. Whereas if we were all just like living in towns of 100 people, we'd all have to kind of make do with something generic. On current margins, economists tend to think that this effect is pretty small, right? That you get benefits from specialization up to, maybe the size of a small city or something, or a small country. But that beyond that, it's basically constant returns to scale. One argument for this is that the gains from trade between pretty similar countries with similar natural resource endowments and so on are estimated to be pretty small. It's sort of funny. I mean, economists are associated, I think, with the idea that like tariffs are really horrible and yeah, right. That there's all these gains from trade, and implicitly that's an argument about increasing returns to scale, right? Because like if there was constant returns to scale, then why bother trading between countries? Each country can just sort of just chop the land in half, and each country produces half as much on its own. And that is in fact what is typically estimated. The gains from trade between the U.S. and Canada or something. It's like maybe a few percent of GDP, which is a lot in the grand scheme, but like it's not that much. And so all the recent sort of fretting about tariffs and stuff, it always, there can be large short run losses if you've built up like a trade network and then you suddenly sever it, right? Because the supply chain has to kind of be reorganized. But in the long run, standard models, standard estimates predict that the effect should be small. Okay. On the other hand, I think in the long run, the effects could be pretty large after all. Okay.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, so my sort of pet theory of this would be that a large part of what's happening, as we develop more advanced technology, is that we make better use of our latent capacity for specialization. So, when, like as academic fields have gotten more specialized, they've been making use of the fact that you had more academics to fill all these specializations, right? One thing we could have done is just keep on like calling everyone a natural philosopher or whatever, like basically all the academics were back in the Middle Ages, or theologian or lawyer or something, but they had like 4 kinds of academics. And then just have, lots of people, largely duplicating each other's work. And if there'd been this big influx in academics and people hadn't yet come up with, molecular biology and all the rest of it, then as they did so, you'd be getting all of these gains, which on some level you could attribute to the development of molecular biology, but like on some level you've got to attribute just to like to the fact that there's more people now to take up this kind of further specialization. And likewise, if you just sort of suddenly moved a bunch of people from small towns into a big city, and you just had a bunch of like middle of the road like barbers and diners and so on that hadn't yet specialized, there would be these gains up to the degree of specialization that the size of the city allowed for, right? But it wouldn't like all be realized at once. So, if a view like that is right, I think it kind of helps to explain what would otherwise be a bit suspicious, which is that, when moving from full sort of individual level autarky, where everyone's self-sufficient, it's all, everyone has their own little house on the prairie, right? There's no gains from trade at all, right? And moving from that to, a kind of modern sort of small city or kind of small country, assuming it's got oil. That's a big case where there are gains from trade, I should have said, but that's clearly not about specialization, right? This is about necessary natural resource. But yeah, you get all these gains from trade up to that size, and then like it just sort of suddenly levels off, and that's just a sort of fact of nature. It seems a little suspicious to me that in the whole space of ways to like, arrange matter and energy to produce things, of value, you get strong benefits from specialization up to the size of a like small modern city in 2025, and then no gains at all after that, right? I would guess that with enough time, if we just stagnated at like current population sizes and, whatever, we would sort of develop more and more specializations, and we would kind of continue to urbanize globally and not just kind of increase the fraction of people in cities, but the fraction of people in the biggest cities. And in time, we would kind of extract ever more benefits of specialization. But just what's happened over the last, century or something is that populations have grown really quickly, and urbanization has grown really quickly, and that's just sort of created this big overhang, if you like, of potential specialization to be exploited. That's kind of one big thought experiment. Here's another thought experiment. It seems to me that the welfare capacity of a being, of a brain, probably tends to grow superlinearly in the size of the brain. So in the EA community and in the animal welfare community, there's a pretty strong inclination that it goes the other way. And a lot of research that seems to support the conclusion that it goes the other way. So people will, like rethink priorities when coming up with their animal welfare weights or whatever. They'll say there are two things that matter. There's how intensely a given creature can feel pleasure or pain, like on a utilitarian perspective, right? How intensely it can feel pleasure and pain, and its list of capacities for valenced experience. Can it feel depression? Can it feel anxiety? Can it feel elation? And they find that small creatures can check off a surprisingly large fraction of the boxes that large ones can, including ourselves. And the intensity on some level doesn't seem to be that much smaller. For little creatures can squeal like they're just about as intensely feeling pain or pleasure as we can. And so they think, okay, well, so all this extra like gray matter that we've got kind of just isn't adding much to our welfare capacity. And I think this is neglecting a dimension of welfare capacity that is analogous to like just the size of a population, which I call like the size of the experience. Okay. So my thought experiment is like, Um, if you so imagine like a split brain case, right? You know, these split brain patients that on some level seem to have two separate streams of experience. If someone's submerged in an ice bath, say, so they're experiencing some pain all over their body, and then you cut their corpus callosum, so now suddenly they have two streams of experience, each of which is only feeling cold on half of a body. On the rethink priorities type view, you've basically doubled the amount of pain in the world, because you now have like two beings that check off the same list and have the same intensity. But I would say that that's crazy, right? That you've just by one snip, you've like doubled the amount of pain in this bathtub. No, like you've probably left it about the same, or if anything, diminished it a little bit to the extent that there are sort of psychologically sophisticated kinds of suffering that can only arise when you have the hemispheres communicating. And likewise, you know, I just think it's a bit absurd to think that there's this intense non-monotonicity where if you disaggregated my neurons into lots of small, you know, mouse brains and then even smaller fly brains, that the sum of the welfare capacities across the whole set of creatures would rise and rise and rise until suddenly it was dust, and then, you know, it's down to zero, right? I think it's probably, you know, more integration, more complexity means more capacity for like value itself. Okay. So I've got more thought experiments along those lines. But so I've got my economics thought, I've got this like brain thought. So what does this all add up to? One and what we were talking about before, right? The parallelizability thought about how at least, you know, eventually, like on some margin, latency could be a really strong bottleneck, and so you get like way more out of one big chip than two small chips, or you know, one automated researcher that in some sense has a double brain rather than two people with normal brains side by side. All of it seems to add up to the possibility that in a sort of radical future where we're, you know, turning Jupiter into some giant computer or whatever, two half Jupiter brains could be a lot less valuable than one whole Jupiter brain. I don't think this kind of extends all the way up, right? So apparently the galaxy is like 100,000 light years across. So unless we're engaged in this very long, slow dance where we're all kind of, you know, playing little parts that kind of can't communicate with each other for a very long time, you probably at some point get plain old constant returns to scale, because like you just kind of can't communicate efficiently over far enough distances. But you'd have to get pretty big for like the speed of light to start being an issue here. And if you get increasing returns to scale for a long way, yeah, I mean, I think that has some potential implications. You know, I mean, one of them is that we should perhaps expect a more peaceful future than we might have anticipated. If you believe the liberal peace hypothesis, that countries that benefit from being able to trade with each other are less likely to go to war. Well, the gains from trade are just going to rise over time as we kind of make use of our capacity for specialization. At least if we don't grow into like space or something more quickly than we can absorb that capacity, right? So if it's the increasing returns to scale thing actually starts showing up more, then maybe that's kind of good news on the peace front. Another implication maybe is that if you're thinking of trying to invest for a really, 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 really long time to, you know, turn matter and energy into hedonium or whatever, you should be more risk tolerant than you otherwise would have been, because it's better to own one whole Jupiter brain than two half Jupiter brains. I guess this is true prudentially as well. If you're just trying to be a kind of hedonist, like a selfishly hedonist futurist, and you want to turn yourself into a Jupiter brain, then you want to increase the chance you get the whole. You care about getting the whole one more than like a, you know, 50-50 chance of getting half. I don't know all the places this could go. It's obviously opening a massive can of worms, but I think it's sort of fun to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the peace thing, like Do you think this is like a core explanation for why we've seen fewer and fewer individual nation states over time? Since if we compare, say, 1800 to today, like, is this the reason actually just returns to scale and it's all just like flowing through this?
Yeah, I've wondered a little bit about that. I don't think it necessarily tells us how big the returns to scale are, because, as long as it's true that to some extent we all benefit from being able to coordinate better, then there's going to be some pressure toward having larger states, right? And with enough time, like when just like over the course of evolution, right? Like even traits with very small fitness advantages can eventually become dominant. So yeah, I don't think it tells us anything quantitatively, but states are kind of effective mechanisms for coordinating groups of people, and they've been getting bigger over time. And this is an example of something I was saying before, right? That like this sort of latency bottleneck, or whatever you want to call it, coordination bottleneck, has been around all along. It doesn't feature in most of our growth models, really. Certainly not the Jones. And it's been getting relieved over time. And so to some extent, we've got to attribute the growth that we've had so far to the ongoing relief of this bottleneck, which means that if in the event of kind of full automation and sort of literal or almost literal galaxy brains, it's that the constraints kind of getting relieved more quickly, that would be a kind of new dimension on which growth could proceed faster than before.
Mm-hmm. So this is not necessarily Phil's theory for why world government is going to exist if you just go with like the long run equilibrium.
Oh no, well, it's an argument for thinking that that eventually a world government's more likely than you would have thought otherwise. Sure, whatever form that takes. I mean, it could be that countries, just collaborate more over time or something, or trade more with each other over time, and the regulations sync up, and it ends up kind of functionally looking like a world government. I mean, I don't know. This prediction would have seemed a lot more sensible like a few decades ago or something, or maybe in 1990, right?
Yeah.
And since then, I think for the first time in history, basically, we've seen an increase in the number of countries in the world, right? They've not a huge increase, but like Czechoslovakia split up, and various countries have split up, and they haven't emerged.
Like all history?
Maybe it's overstating it, but I think actually I was reading something a while back that like this past 35 years basically has been unique on record. We have no idea like this average size of tribes and the it's been anomalous as far as the records go, I think. There are more wars now than there were 10 years ago or whatever. Mm-hmm. So, you never know what the future holds, but this is just one argument on the pile for the thought that, like, in the long run, if the more efficient arrangement wins out, it'll probably involve kind of more, more integration and fewer states. Yeah, because the degree of increasing returns to scale will itself rise over time as we make better kind of use of our latent capacity.
Okay. I think this is a good place to end. Okay. Thank you for joining us on the Epoch podcast, Phil.
Thank you, Anson.
And thank you all for tuning in to Epoch AI's podcast. We look forward to you joining us for future episodes.